Friday the 13th was not always considered unlucky. For most of the medieval world, the number 13 carried no special dread, and Fridays were simply the day the crucifixion was remembered, ordinary, solemn, nothing more. Then, on one particular Friday the 13th, in the autumn of 1307, soldiers acting on sealed orders from the King of France broke into houses across the country before dawn and arrested every member of the wealthiest, most powerful religious military order in Christendom, in a single coordinated strike most of Europe never saw coming. Historians still argue about exactly how much that one day contributed to the superstition that bears its date. What almost nobody disputes is that this was the day the Knights Templars' 200-year story turned from one of the medieval world's great success stories into one of its most notorious downfalls. You likely already know the Templars existed, and you likely already know they ended badly. What you may not know is almost everything in between: how 9 knights with no money became the bankers of kings, how a monastic vow of poverty produced one of the richest organizations in Europe, and how a set of confessions extracted under torture became, centuries later, the seed of an entire mythology involving secret treasures, hidden bloodlines, and holy relics the Templars almost certainly never possessed. Tonight is for the actual story, the founding, the fighting, the fortune, and the fall, told in the order it actually happened, before legend rearranged it into something else. No hidden vault, no secret bloodline, no suppressed relic waiting at the end of it, just 2 centuries of genuinely consequential human decisions, made by identifiable people for identifiable reasons. Which is, if you let it be, a considerably more satisfying kind of story than the one popular imagination eventually settled for instead. So let the evening settle around you, and let this unfold slowly, the way genuinely complicated history deserves to. If patient, unhurried accounts like this one are the kind of thing you find yourself drawn back to, there's a subscribe button nearby, worth using only if these long evenings with old history are actually doing something for you. Everything else can wait until tomorrow. It begins not with conspiracy or legend, but with 9 tired knights, a dangerous road, and a king willing to give them somewhere to sleep. In the years following the First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem in 1099, an earlier chapter in this channel's account of the Crusades covers that campaign in far more detail, and this account will lean on it only where the 2 stories genuinely intersect. The newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem faced a problem its conquest alone had not solved. Thousands of Christian pilgrims, drawn by the now accessible holy sites, streamed into the region every year from across Western Europe, traveling the roads between the coastal ports and Jerusalem itself largely undefended. Bandits and hostile raiders preyed on these unarmed travelers with, by surviving accounts, considerable regularity and considerable violence. And the fledgling kingdom's small garrison had neither the manpower nor the mandate to patrol every pilgrim road in the surrounding countryside. Around 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens, along with a small group of companions most commonly numbered at 9, a figure some modern historians treat with mild caution, since it appears mainly in later, somewhat legendary retellings rather than contemporary documentation, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with an unusual proposal. They would form a religious order of knights, bound by monastic vows like any group of monks, but dedicated specifically to protecting pilgrims on the roads to and from the Holy City, combining armed combat readiness with the discipline and poverty of monastic life, an idea with essentially no real precedent in Western Christendom at the time. Baldwin agreed, seeing in the proposal a genuinely useful, low-cost solution to a security problem his own kingdom's limited resources had struggled to address, and granted the small group quarters in a wing of the royal palace built on the Temple Mount, on or near the site widely believed in that era to be the ruins of the ancient Temple of Solomon. This single detail of geography gave the new order its name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, shortened over time to simply the Knights Templar, a name that would eventually attach itself to one of the most recognizable symbols in medieval history despite the order's actual founding being this modest, a handful of knights, a borrowed room, and a genuinely dangerous stretch of road they had volunteered to guard. For roughly the first decade of their existence, the Templars remained a small, somewhat obscure operation, without significant funding, formal church recognition, or any of the wealth and influence that would come to define them within a generation. A French pilgrim named Fulk of Anjou, Count and later King, is recorded among the earliest financial patrons of this obscure little brotherhood, granting an annual sum that, however modest by the order's later standards, represented one of the very first outside investments in an organization that had, up to that point, survived largely on whatever its own founding knights could scrape together. That would change, and change dramatically, once one of the most respected churchmen in Western Europe decided the new order deserved his personal endorsement. History remembers Hugues de Payens as the Templars' founder, and rightly so, but the small band of companions who joined him in that first, uncertain decade deserve more than the passing mention most retellings of this story give them, since several went on to shape the order considerably beyond its first Jerusalem garrison. Godfrey de Saint-Omer, a knight from Flanders, is generally named as Hugues's closest early collaborator, so consistently paired with him in the earliest surviving references to the order that some later medieval chroniclers occasionally, and incorrectly, credited him as a co-founder of equal standing rather than a senior companion. Payen de Montdidier and Archambaud de Saint-Amand appear among the other founding knights named in later Templar tradition, though the surviving contemporary evidence for the group's exact original membership is thinner than popular retellings often suggest, a genuine gap in the record this account should be honest about, rather than filling in with more confidence than the sources actually support. André de Montbard, already introduced in this account as Bernard of Clairvaux's uncle, would go on to serve as the order's fifth Grand Master decades later, a detail that illustrates how thoroughly interwoven the Templars' early leadership remained with the same small circle of French noble families across multiple generations. Hugues de Payens himself led the order for roughly 2 decades, traveling extensively across Western Europe following the Council of Troyes to recruit new members and solicit the land donations this account will examine in more detail shortly, before dying in 1136 or 1137 as Grand Master, having lived to see his small and formal band of pilgrim protectors transformed into a papally sanctioned order with a written rule, growing wealth, and a rapidly expanding presence across Christendom, a transformation whose speed would likely have startled even Hugues himself, had anyone been able to show him, on that first dangerous pilgrim road in 1119, exactly what his small proposal to King Baldwin would eventually become. The office of Grand Master that Hugues left behind would be held by 22 further men across the 2 centuries that followed, most ruling for a decade or more, a handful for only a few brief years cut short by battlefield death or the ordinary hazards of a genuinely dangerous, physically demanding position. This account will not walk through the full list, most left too thin a documentary record to support any real narrative of their individual tenures, but the office itself, elected for life by the Order's senior chapter rather than inherited or appointed by any outside authority, gave the Templars a form of institutional continuity considerably more stable than many contemporary secular monarchies managed to achieve across the same 2 centuries, at least until the office's final holder found himself facing a crisis no amount of institutional stability could have prepared him for. The churchman in question was Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian abbot whose influence over Western Christian religious life in the early 12th century was, by any measure, extraordinary, a tireless reformer, a gifted and prolific writer, and a figure whose personal endorsement of nearly any cause tended to transform its fortunes almost overnight. Bernard had a personal connection to the fledgling order as well. André de Montbard, one of the original founding knights alongside Hugues de Payens, was Bernard's own uncle, giving the Cistercian abbot both a family tie and a direct line of communication to the new order's leadership. In 1129, at a church council held in the French city of Troyes, the Knights Templar received formal recognition from the Catholic Church, along with a written rule governing their conduct. A document drafted with substantial input from Bernard himself, drawing heavily on the austere Cistercian monastic customs Bernard knew intimately, adapted to accommodate the order's unusual military dimension. The rule specified nearly every aspect of a Templar knight's daily existence: communal meals eaten in near silence, restrictions on personal possessions, regulated hours of prayer, and a prohibition on the kind of personal display and luxury that characterized much of the secular medieval nobility from which many Templar recruits actually came. Formal recognition alone would not have been enough to overcome the genuine theological unease many contemporaries felt about the very concept the Templars represented. Men bound by monastic vows who were nonetheless expected, even required, to kill in combat, a combination that struck a considerable number of churchmen and lay people alike as, at minimum, deeply uncomfortable. Bernard addressed this discomfort directly in a treatise he wrote specifically defending the new order, titled In Praise of the New Knighthood, arguing that violence committed in defense of pilgrims and the Holy Land, by men who had renounced worldly ambition and personal gain, represented something categorically different from the vainglorious warfare of secular knights, not murder, and Bernard's formulation, but Molaycide, the killing of evil itself rather than of a human soul. This theological defense, paired with Bernard's own towering personal reputation, proved remarkably effective. Within a decade of the Council of Troyes, the Templars received a series of extraordinary papal privileges, most significantly the 1139 bull Omnidatum Optimum, issued by Pope Innocent II, which placed the order under the Pope's direct authority alone, exempting the Templars from the jurisdiction of local bishops, local rulers, and virtually every other layer of medieval ecclesiastical and secular authority that might otherwise have constrained them. The practical consequences of this independence would prove immense, and not always popular with the local churchmen and nobles who suddenly found an armed, wealthy, tax-exempt organization operating within their own territories answerable to nobody but a pope hundreds of miles away. Bishops in particular resented losing tithe income to Templar churches exempt from ordinary ecclesiastical taxation, a resentment that simmered, largely unresolved, for the better part of 2 centuries. To understand how the Templars actually functioned, day to day, it helps to set aside the popular image of a knight in shining armor and instead picture something closer to a monastery that happened to maintain a standing army, because that, in practical terms, is closer to what the order actually was. Full Templar knights, the figures most associated with the order in popular memory, wore a distinctive white mantle, a color reserved for full knightly members and symbolizing purity in the order's own religious framework. The now iconic red cross was added to that white mantle somewhat later, in 1147, granted by Pope Eugene III specifically as a crusading symbol rather than being part of the order's original habit. Knights, however, made up only a minority of the order's total membership, a fact that surprises many people encountering the Templars' actual internal structure for the first time. Sergeants, drawn from non-noble backgrounds and wearing a darker brown or black mantle rather than white, performed both military and administrative functions and considerably outnumbered the knightly class. Chaplains, ordained priests within the order, handled the Templars' considerable religious obligations, since the order maintained its own churches and clergy under the independence granted by papal privilege. And beneath all of this sat a large, largely overlooked population of craftsmen, farmers, shepherds, and estate managers. Since the Templars' European properties required exactly the kind of skilled agricultural and administrative labor any large medieval landholding needed to function and turn a profit. The order's military discipline, when deployed in actual combat, was reportedly exceptional by the standards of the period, governed by strict rules embedded directly in the Templar rule itself. Knights could not retreat from battle unless outnumbered by a ratio the rule specified in some detail, could not act independently of a direct order from a superior even in the heat of combat, and were expected to hold formation with a rigor that distinguished them from the more individually glory-driven combat style common among secular medieval knighthood. This discipline, alongside the order's genuine religious conviction and its members' willingness to fight to the death rather than retreat without orders, made Templar contingents disproportionately effective on Crusader battlefields relative to their actual numbers, which at any given moment remained relatively modest compared to the broader Crusader armies they fought alongside. Supporting this military capability, however, required resources on a scale a small crusading order could never generate through battlefield plunder alone. And it was in solving exactly this problem that the Templars stumbled into an innovation that would eventually make them far more famous, and in some ways far more consequential, than their military record ever could. Before turning to that financial innovation, it's worth understanding a little more of how the Templars actually fought, since the order's battlefield reputation rested on specific, codified customs considerably more detailed than simple discipline and courage. The Templars carried into battle a distinctive two-tone banner, black over white, known as the Beauséant, a name later tradition also attached to the Templars' war cry. And the rule treated the loss or abandonment of this banner as a matter of the utmost seriousness, since a Templar unit that lost sight of its banner in the chaos of battle risked losing its cohesion entirely, scattering into exactly the kind of disorganized individual combat the Order's entire military doctrine was designed to avoid. The rule specified, with a level of procedural detail modern readers sometimes find almost bureaucratic, exactly what a knight was permitted to do if his horse was killed beneath him, how far he could pursue a fleeing enemy before being required to return to formation, and under what specific circumstances a knight could break ranks without first receiving direct orders, essentially never, except to rescue a fellow Christian in immediate, visible danger of death, a narrow exception that still required the rescuing knight to return to formation the instant the rescue was complete. Breaking formation without proper cause, fleeing before the banner fell, or abandoning a fellow knight in battle counted among the most serious offenses a Templar could commit, punishable by expulsion from the order. A fate that, for a man who had built his entire identity and social standing around Templar membership, carried consequences extending considerably beyond the battlefield itself. This rigid, almost mathematical approach to battlefield conduct helps explain why medieval commentators across both Crusader and Muslim sources, whatever their other disagreements, tended to describe Templar units with a consistent vocabulary of disciplined dread, an enemy formation that did not break easily, did not scatter under pressure, and could be relied upon, for better or worse, to hold its position exactly as ordered until the battle's outcome was well and truly decided. Before turning to that financial innovation, it's worth pausing on what an ordinary day actually looked like for the men who joined the order, since the rule this account has already introduced governed considerably more than battlefield conduct. It governed nearly every waking hour, and a level of regulated detail that reads, to modern eyes, closer to a strict monastic timetable than to anything resembling a soldier's barracks life. A Templar's day began well before dawn with matins, the first of the canonical prayer hours borrowed directly from broader Cistercian monastic practice, followed by further fixed prayer services spaced through the day and evening, a rhythm that structured Templar life around worship as rigorously as it structured it around combat readiness. Meals were taken communally and largely in silence, with a passage of scripture read aloud while the knights ate, and the rule specified in genuine detail what could and could not appear on the table. Meat permitted 3 times a week, simpler fare on other days, and an explicit prohibition on waste, down to instructions about how bread was to be handled and shared. Personal ornamentation of any kind was forbidden. No decorated weapons, no elaborate saddlery, nothing that might mark a Templar knight as pursuing personal glory or vanity rather than collective purpose. Knights were required to keep their beards, a visible point of contrast with the clean-shaven fashion common among secular nobility of parts of the period, intended as a further mark of humility and separation from worldly display. Even recreational activity fell under regulation. Chess, a popular pastime among medieval nobility, was explicitly forbidden as a frivolous distraction, while hunting was banned outright with one specific exception, hunting lions, permitted precisely because it doubled as functional combat practice and carried clear symbolic weight within the order's own religious imagination. The lion standing in for the devil, the Templars understood themselves to be hunting down in a considerably more literal sense on actual Crusader battlefields. Admission into the order followed a formal, and notably private, initiation ceremony, conducted away from public view among already professed members, a practice that was, in the broader context of medieval religious and fraternal life, entirely unremarkable, since numerous monastic orders and guilds of the period conducted their own admission rites with similar privacy. This ordinary institutional secrecy would, 2 centuries later, be turned into damning evidence by prosecutors determined to prove the Templars had something sinister to hide, a detail worth holding on to now, since it will matter considerably more once this account reaches the order's downfall. Pilgrims traveling from Western Europe to Jerusalem faced a persistent and genuinely dangerous problem quite apart from the road bandits this account has already described. Carrying enough money to fund a months-long journey meant carrying a visible, portable target, since medieval travelers had no practical way to access funds along their route other than physically transporting coin the entire distance. The Templars, with fortified properties scattered across Western Europe and a permanent presence in the Holy Land itself, were uniquely positioned to solve this problem, and by the middle of the 12th century had developed a system that functioned, in essence, as an early form of banking. A solution that grew directly and organically out of the Order's existing pilgrim protection mission, rather than representing any planned pivot toward finance as a new institutional priority. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar house in their home country, receive a document, encoded or sealed in ways designed to resist forgery. Since the entire system depended on the document being genuinely difficult to fake, and then present that document at a Templar house near Jerusalem to withdraw an equivalent sum, all without carrying a single physical coin across the dangerous intervening distance. The Templars charged for this service, and the arrangement proved so useful and so profitable that it expanded well beyond simple pilgrim deposits. Kings and nobles began using Templar houses to store treasuries securely, to transfer large sums across long distances, and eventually to borrow money outright, with the Templars charging interest through various arrangements structured carefully enough to avoid the Church's own prohibitions on outright usury, often disguised as administrative or currency exchange fees rather than interest in name, a distinction medieval canon lawyers took considerably more seriously than it might sound to modern ears. By the 13th century, the Knights Templar had become, in practical terms, one of medieval Europe's most trusted financial institutions, serving as bankers not merely to pilgrims and minor nobility but to the French crown itself. For a significant stretch of the century, the royal treasury of France was, for a time, physically housed within the fortified Paris Temple, the order's headquarters in the city, placing an enormous quantity of the French kingdom's actual wealth under Templar management and Templar walls. Templar officials, drawing on decades of accumulated financial expertise, also frequently served the French crown directly as treasurers and financial administrators, individuals who understood double-entry style record-keeping and long-distance fund transfer considerably better than most secular royal officials of the period. This financial role, established gradually and almost incidentally as a solution to a practical pilgrim safety problem, would eventually intersect with royal politics in ways none of the order's founders could plausibly have anticipated, and not to the order's benefit. The Templars' financial success sat, from its earliest years, in genuine tension with medieval Christian teaching on the subject of money itself, a tension worth understanding in some detail, since it helps explain why the order's later reputation for hidden, possibly sinister wealth found such receptive ground among Philip IV prosecutors decades later. Canon law throughout the medieval period treated usury, broadly defined as charging interest on a loan simply for the use of money over time, as a serious sin. Grounded in biblical prohibitions the Church took seriously enough to bar convicted usurers from Christian burial in some jurisdictions and periods. The Templars, along with other medieval institutions engaged in large-scale lending, navigated this prohibition through a range of technically distinct but practically similar financial arrangements. Administrative fees, currency exchange charges, and structured penalties for late repayment that functioned, in economic substance, remarkably similarly to straightforward interest, while remaining technically defensible under the letter, if not always the obvious spirit, of canon law's usury. Prohibition. Jewish moneylenders, operating under a separate and considerably more openly acknowledged set of legal and religious rules regarding interest, filled much of the same credit demand across medieval Europe during this period, and the two systems, Templar quasi-banking on one hand, openly acknowledged Jewish moneylending on the other, coexisted as the two principal sources of large-scale credit available to medieval European rulers and nobility, a parallel this account's later chapter on Philip IV's financial desperation will find genuinely relevant, since Philip would eventually turn against both sources of credit in strikingly similar fashion within the same handful of years. Templar financial officials, drawing on decades of accumulated practical experience, became genuinely skilled at structuring these arrangements in ways that satisfied both their royal and noble clients' need for credit and the Church's own theological requirements. A balancing act that worked successfully for generations, but that also left the order's finances somewhat opaque to outside observers, depended on specialized internal expertise that few people outside the order fully understood. That opacity, harmless enough while the order enjoyed broad trust and papal protection, would prove considerably more dangerous once a king determined to destroy the Templars needed only to gesture vaguely at secret financial dealings and unexplained wealth to make his broader case of hidden wrongdoing sound plausible to an audience who had never fully understood how Templar banking actually worked in the first place. Financial services alone do not fully explain how a monastic order founded by 9 knights with essentially no resources became, within little more than a century, one of the wealthiest organizations in the whole of Western Christendom. The other major source of Templar wealth was considerably more straightforward: land, donated directly to the order by pious nobility across nearly every corner of Western Europe. Donating property to a religious order in exchange for prayers on behalf of one's soul was an established and common practice throughout medieval Christendom, but the Templars, benefiting from Bernard of Clairvaux's endorsement and the broader crusading enthusiasm sweeping Europe throughout the 12th century, attracted an especially large volume of these donations, from modest parcels of farmland given by minor local nobility up to substantial estates granted by kings and great territorial lords. These donated properties, organized into administrative units called commanderies, spread across France, England, Iberia, Germany, Italy, and Hungary, functioning as agricultural estates that generated income specifically earmarked to fund the order's military operations in the distant Holy Land. Modern historians estimate the Templars controlled somewhere in the range of several thousand such properties at the order's height. Precise counts vary considerably depending on methodology and period, but even conservative estimates describe a landholding network of genuinely continental scale, making the Templars, in effect, one of medieval Europe's largest and most sophisticated multinational organizations, centuries before that particular term existed to describe anything. Some individual commanderies grew large enough to function as substantial rural settlements in their own right, complete with mills, vineyards, and their own dependent tenant populations working land under Templar administration. Not all of this expansion happened solely through peaceful donation either. In the Iberian Peninsula, where Christian kingdoms spent centuries pursuing the long, intermittent territorial reconquest of Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus, historians call the Reconquista, the Templars took on a military role considerably closer to home than their more famous engagements in the distant Holy Land. Iberian monarchs, eager for experienced, well-organized military support along their own contested frontiers, granted the order substantial frontier territories in exchange for garrisoning and defending them, most notably in the Kingdom of Aragon, where King Alfonso the Battlers will controversially attempted, in 1131, to leave a considerable portion of his entire kingdom jointly to the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Holy Sepulchre, a bequest the Aragonese nobility ultimately refused to honor in full, though the Templars still emerged from the resulting negotiated settlement with substantial Iberian landholdings and an ongoing military role in the peninsula's Reconquista campaigns that would continue for generations alongside the order's better-known commitments in the Levant. Precisely how many people this network actually employed remains a genuinely debated question among historians, since surviving Templar records are incomplete and the order never left behind anything resembling a comprehensive modern census. Estimates for total order-wide membership at its early 14th century peak across every rank this account has already described, knights, sergeants, chaplains, and the far larger population of agricultural and administrative staff, generally range somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people, though individual scholarly estimates vary considerably depending on methodology and which categories of affiliated lay workers are counted as genuine members versus simply employees of Templar-owned land. Of that total, the number of full knights actually available for combat service in the Holy Land at any given moment was almost certainly a small fraction of the whole, plausibly only a few hundred to around 1,000 at most points in the Order's history, meaning the Templars' outsized reputation for military power rested considerably more on discipline, wealth, and organizational reach than on any genuinely overwhelming battlefield numbers. This vast network required its own internal bureaucracy to manage effectively, regional commanders, estate administrators, and a chain of reporting that stretched from small rural commanderies up through provincial leadership and ultimately to the Grand Master, the Order's elected head, who in practice spent much of his time managing this sprawling European economic empire even while the Order's stated purpose remained fixed on events unfolding thousands of miles away in the Holy Land. It is worth pausing on the genuine strangeness of this arrangement. A religious order whose knights had taken vows of personal poverty had, as an institution, become extraordinarily wealthy, a tension that would remain largely unremarked upon during the Order's rise, and would return with devastating consequences during its fall. The Order itself seemed at least partly aware of this tension, and expressed an answer to it, deliberately or not, in one of its most enduring and most frequently misunderstood pieces of imagery. The official seal used to authenticate Templar documents, which depicted not a single mounted warrior but two knights sharing a single horse. The image has invited centuries of competing interpretation. Some read it as a straightforward reference to the Order's founding poverty, a visual reminder that Hugues de Payens and his first companions had genuinely lacked the resources to equip every knight with his own mount. Others have proposed considerably more elaborate readings, including later esoteric interpretations with no real grounding in any contemporary Templar source, treating the two writers as a coded reference to secret hierarchy or hidden doctrine rather than the far more mundane explanation the Order's own documented origins actually support. Whatever its precise original intent, the seal's two writers capture something genuinely true about the institution this account has been describing, an order that began in literal poverty, whose knights individually renounced personal wealth as a condition of membership, and that nonetheless grew, as an institution, into one of the richest organizations medieval Europe had ever seen. The two knights on one horse, sharing what little they had, remained the Order's official self-image on every sealed document it issued, straight through the very decades in which its actual treasuries, landholdings, and financial reach had grown to a scale the seal's modest imagery no longer remotely reflected. For all the financial and administrative apparatus this account has just described, the Templars' original and most publicly visible role remained military, and across the 12th and 13th centuries, Templar contingents fought in the majority of the crusading period's major engagements in the Levant, campaigns this channel's earlier account of the Crusades traces in considerably more detail, and which this account will touch only briefly, focusing specifically on the Templars' own part. Within that broader story, the Order's disciplined fighting style, described in the previous chapters, made Templar units particularly valuable as a battlefield vanguard or rearguard, positions requiring exactly the kind of unwavering discipline the Templar rule demanded. One of the order's most celebrated military moments came at the Battle of Montvisard in 1177, where a Crusader force considerably smaller than the invading Ayyubid army, led in person by the young King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, a monarch whose own leprosy makes his active battlefield leadership at Montvisard a striking historical detail in its own right, decisively defeated a much larger force under Saladin, with Templar knights, numbering only a few hundred among the broader Crusader army, playing a prominent role in the surprise assault that broke the Ayyubid formation. The victory proved temporary in the broader arc of the conflict, but it illustrated, in miniature, exactly the kind of disciplined, aggressive cavalry engagement the Templars had spent decades training to execute. Not every engagement went so favorably, and the Order's own rigid discipline occasionally proved a liability rather than an asset, particularly when Templar leadership pushed for aggressive action against better military judgment. That tension would prove catastrophically relevant a decade after Montvisard, when Templar Grand Master Gerard de Riedfort played a significant and, by most historical assessments, genuinely reckless role in pushing the kingdom's leadership toward the single most disastrous battlefield decision in the entire history of the Crusader states. Templar involvement in the crusading movement was never confined to the defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem alone, and one campaign worth a brief detour illustrates just how far the Order's military commitments actually extended. In 1217, a new crusading expedition, drawing forces from across Western Europe and lacking any single dominant royal leader the way earlier campaigns this account has described generally had, targeted Egypt directly, reasoning, not unreasonably, given Egypt's role as the Ayyubid dynasty's economic and military heartland, that controlling the Nile Delta might ultimately prove a faster route to recovering Jerusalem than repeated direct assaults on the Holy Land itself. The Fifth Crusade's central operation became a prolonged siege of the fortified Egyptian port city of Damietta, a siege that dragged on for well over a year before finally succeeding in 1219, with Templar forces contributing troops, funding, and naval support throughout the grinding campaign, alongside the Hospitallers and a broader coalition of Crusader nobility. Damietta's capture briefly raised genuine hope of a decisive breakthrough, with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil reportedly offering to exchange the city for Jerusalem itself in a negotiated settlement, an offer the Crusade's papal legate, Pelagius, controversially rejected, gambling instead on further military advance toward Cairo. That gamble failed badly. Crusader forces, including the Templar contingent, advanced into the Nile Delta during the following season's flooding, found their supply lines cut and their army trapped by rising floodwaters the Ayyubid defenders had deliberately manipulated, and were ultimately forced to surrender Damietta back in exchange for safe passage out of Egypt entirely, a costly, demoralizing reversal that cost the Fifth Crusade nearly everything its long, expensive siege had achieved, and a reminder, worth carrying into the chapters ahead, that Templar military commitment extended across a considerably wider Mediterranean stage than the Kingdom of Jerusalem's own borders alone. Before this account turns to that disaster, it's worth pausing on a relationship that rarely fits the simple picture most people carry of the crusading era Levant as a straightforward contest between Christian and Muslim forces, the Templars' long, complicated dealings with the Nizari Ismaili sect Western Crusader sources called the Assassins. Based in a network of fortified mountain strongholds across Syria and Persia, the Assassins pursued a distinctive strategy of targeted political killing rather than open battlefield warfare, a reputation so fearsome that their name, filtered through medieval Western retellings of uncertain reliability regarding its actual origin, eventually entered European languages as a general word for a hired killer. Popular imagination tends to picture the assassins as an unstoppable, universally feared force, which makes the Templars' actual documented relationship with them genuinely surprising. Rather than existing in a state of constant warfare, the two organizations at various points settled into a pragmatic, even transactional arrangement, with the assassins reportedly paying an annual tribute to the Templars to secure a degree of security from Templar raids on their own territory, a reversal of the usual assumption about who held the upper hand in that particular relationship. Diplomatic contact between the two also occurred on at least one occasion, contemporary sources describe in some detail, involving a reported offer from the assassin leadership, sometimes called the Old Man of the Mountain in Western accounts, proposing conversion to Christianity and a formal alliance in exchange for release from that same tribute obligation. An offer some chronicles claim was violently sabotaged by a Templar knight who killed the assassin envoys before the proposal could be formally accepted, causing considerable diplomatic embarrassment for the order. Modern historians treat the specific details of this episode with real caution, given how thin and one-sided the surviving sources describing it actually are, but the broader pattern it illustrates is well supported. Alliances and enmities across the crusading era Levant rarely broke down along neat religious lines, with practical political and financial calculation just as often overriding any simple story of two civilizations locked in permanent, uncomplicated conflict. The Hospitallers maintained a broadly similar arrangement with the assassins over the same period, and both military orders, along with several secular crusader lords, periodically found themselves negotiating, trading, or briefly allying with Muslim powers whenever it suited their immediate strategic interests, exactly as Muslim rulers of the period negotiated and allied among themselves and, on occasion, with crusader factions against rival Muslim neighbors. None of this pragmatism erased the genuine religious conviction driving the broader crusading movement on both sides, nor should it be read as evidence that the era's violence was somehow less real or less consequential than it actually was, but it is a useful corrective to the tendency, common in both medieval propaganda and some modern popular retellings alike, to flatten a genuinely complicated two-century political landscape into a simpler story than the surviving evidence actually supports. In July of 1187, at an arid, twin-peaked hill in Galilee known as the Horns of Hattin, the combined army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched into a battle that would end, within a single catastrophic day, in one of the most complete military disasters the Crusader states ever suffered, a battle this channel's earlier account of the Crusades describes in fuller detail, since its consequences extended across the entire Crusader world rather than the Templars specifically. Grand Master Gerard de Riedfort was among the voices most forcefully urging King Guy of Jerusalem toward the aggressive march that led the Crusader army, exhausted and desperately short of water, directly into a position of Saladin's own choosing. Contemporary chroniclers on both sides describe the Crusader army's final hours at Hattin in genuinely harrowing terms. Surrounded on the arid hilltop, the exhausted Crusader infantry broke first, some fleeing toward the Sea of Galilee's distant waters they could see but never reach, while Saladin's forces set fire to the dry summer scrubland around the Crusader position, adding choking smoke to a battlefield already defined by thirst and exhaustion after a forced march with no water source. Along the way, the relic Crusader forces had carried into battle as a rallying symbol and a mark of divine favor, a fragment of the true cross housed in Jerusalem and brought onto campaign for exactly this kind of decisive engagement, was captured by Saladin's forces during the battle's final collapse. a loss contemporary Christian sources describe with a sense of spiritual devastation arguably exceeding even their grief over the battle's staggering human cost, since the relic's capture read, to many contemporaries, as a kind of theological verdict on the entire campaign. The result was a near-total destruction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army, and for the Templars specifically, the aftermath carried a particular horror. Saladin, according to multiple contemporary accounts, treated captured members of the military orders, Templars and Hospitallers both, with a severity he did not extend to captured secular knights and nobility, who were generally held for ransom according to the conventional practices of the period. Members of the military orders, by contrast, were largely executed following the battle, a decision contemporary sources attribute to Saladin's assessment that these particular fighters, bound by religious vow rather than ordinary feudal obligation, represented a uniquely persistent and fanatical military threat unlikely to honor any ransom-based release the way an ordinary captured noble might. Gerard de Riedfort himself was, notably, among the very few Templars spared execution after Hattin, a survival some contemporary and later commentators attributed to his perceived usefulness as a bargaining tool given his rank, though the precise reasoning behind Saladin's decision in this individual case remains debated. The Grand Master would not survive much longer regardless, dying several years later during the prolonged Crusader siege operations to retake Acre. Hattin's consequences for the wider Crusader world, including the fall of Jerusalem itself later that same year, belong to this channel's earlier, fuller account of the Crusades. For the Templars specifically, Hattin marked the beginning of a long, uneven retreat that would occupy the order for the whole of the following century. The Crusader response to Hattin, the Third Crusade, and the arrival of Western Europe's most famous crusading monarch, belongs, in its fullest form, to this channel's earlier account of the Crusades. But one specific episode from that campaign involves the Templars directly enough, and remains obscure enough in popular memory, that it deserves a moment's attention here. In 1191, King Richard I of England, sailing east to join the Crusade, found his fleet scattered by storms, with several ships, including one carrying his own sister and his fiancée, forced ashore on Cyprus, then ruled by a rebellious Byzantine governor named Isaac Komnenos, who treated the shipwrecked Crusaders with open hostility. Richard responded by conquering the entire island in a matter of weeks, acquiring, almost as an improvised afterthought to a rescue mission, a substantial Mediterranean territory he had no particular plan for. Needing funds to continue his campaign in the Holy Land, Richard sold Cyprus to the Knights Templar shortly afterward for a considerable sum. The Templars attempted to govern the island directly, but their small garrison faced an uprising from the local population within less than a year, the harsh taxation the Templars imposed to recoup their purchase price, combined with the resentment of a population that had simply exchanged one distant, unwelcome ruler for another, proved more than the Order's limited administrative presence on the island could contain. Rather than commit further resources to suppressing the rebellion, the Templars returned Cyprus to Richard, who promptly sold it a second time, to Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king of Jerusalem who had led the Crusader army to disaster at Hattin and now needed a kingdom of his own considerably more than the Templars needed an unprofitable island. Guy's family, the Lusignans, would rule Cyprus for the better part of 3 centuries afterward, and in one of this story's neater circularities, it was Lusignan Cyprus that would eventually give the Knights Templar refuge a full century later, after the fall of Acre finally ended the Order's presence on the Levantine mainland altogether. The century following Hattin was, for the Knights Templar as for the Crusader states more broadly, a story of gradual contraction rather than any single dramatic collapse, a slow, uneven retreat punctuated by occasional recoveries, none of them lasting. The Third Crusade, launched in response to Jerusalem's fall, succeeded in recapturing a strip of coastal territory and re-established Acre as the Crusader state's new principal stronghold, a role the city would retain for the remaining century of Outremer's existence, but Jerusalem itself remained beyond Crusader control for the rest of the medieval period, restored only briefly and diplomatically decades later under altogether different circumstances this account will not detour into here. Throughout the 13th century, the Templars continued fighting alongside the shrinking coalition of Crusader states, participating in further crusading expeditions launched from Western Europe with declining frequency and declining success, while simultaneously managing the Order's vast and still profitable European landholdings from a Holy Land headquarters that grew steadily more precarious with each passing decade. Mamluk Egypt, which had absorbed and replaced the Ayyubid dynasty Saladin himself had founded, proved a far more relentless and militarily capable adversary than the fractured Crusader states, divided as they often were by their own internal rivalries, could consistently withstand. By the final decades of the 13th century, the once substantial network of Crusader territories had shrunk to little more than a scattering of coastal cities and fortresses, Acre chief among them, holding on less through any realistic prospect of reconquest and more through sheer fortification and the continued, if increasingly thin, flow of resources and reinforcements from Western Europe. The Templars, alongside the Hospitallers and the smaller Teutonic Order, formed the core of whatever active military defense these remaining territories still possessed, a defense that would face its final, decisive test in the spring of 1291. One further thread from this long, uneven 13th century retreat deserves mention, since it complicates the simple picture of the crusading period as a straightforward two-sided struggle just as thoroughly as this account's earlier chapter on the assassins already did. Through the middle and later 13th century, the rapidly expanding Mongol Empire, and later its Middle Eastern successor state the Ilkhanate, emerged as a third major power in the region, one that periodically found itself at war with the same Mamluk Sultanate the Crusader states themselves were struggling against, creating, at least in theory, a natural opportunity for a Crusader-Mongol alliance against a shared enemy. Templar leadership, along with the broader Crusader states, engaged in genuine, sustained diplomatic contact with Mongol Ilkhanate rulers across several decades, exchanging letters and embassies exploring the possibility of coordinated military action against the Mamluks, and Templar forces did, on at least one occasion in the 1290s, participate in joint operations alongside Mongol raiding parties into Mamluk-held Syria. Surviving Ilkhanate correspondence, some of it preserved today in European archives, shows Mongol rulers repeatedly proposing specific joint campaign dates and troop commitments to European powers including the papacy, offers that Western Christendom, still recovering from its own internal disputes and never quite able to organize a matching commitment on short Mongol timetables, was never able to fully reciprocate before the strategic window for any such alliance closed for good. These efforts at alliance never produced the kind of decisive combined offensive that might genuinely have altered the Crusader state's declining fortunes, hampered by the sheer logistical distance separating the two powers, by recurring Mongol internal succession crises that repeatedly interrupted sustained military commitment, and by a basic mismatch between Mongol strategic priorities, focused on their own vast multi-front empire, and the considerably narrower, more urgent survival concerns of the shrinking Crusader coastline. The alliance that might have been remains, in the judgment of most historians who have studied it, one of the more genuinely intriguing might-have-beens of the entire crusading period. A reminder that the century's political map involved considerably more than the two sides popular memory usually assigns to it. In the spring of 1291, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil brought a massive siege force against Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold remaining in the Holy Land, and an assault both sides understood. In a way, earlier sieges of the crusading period had not always been so clearly understood to represent something close to a final reckoning for the entire Crusader presence in the region. The defenders, a combined force of Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and the city's own garrison and civilian population, held out through weeks of increasingly desperate fighting against an attacking force that considerably outnumbered them and possessed far superior siege equipment. The siege itself lasted approximately 6 weeks, an extraordinarily compressed timeline given the scale of the forces involved. Contemporary estimates, treated with the same caution this account has already applied to other medieval troop figures, describe a Mamluk besieging force considerably larger than anything the city's defenders, drawn from Acre's civilian population alongside the military order's garrisons, could realistically have matched even at full strength. Templar Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu was killed during the fighting, struck by a crossbow bolt while attempting to rally the city's defense at a critical breach in Acre's walls, and his death, coming as it did during the siege's final and most desperate phase, is generally described by historians as a significant blow to the coordination of the city's remaining defense. After Acre's outer defenses collapsed, a small contingent of Templars and civilian refugees retreated into the Order's fortified compound within the city, holding out for several additional days after the rest of Acre had fallen, before that final position, too, was overwhelmed. With Acre's fall, the Crusader state's mainland presence in the Holy Land effectively ended after nearly 2 centuries. The Templars, along with the other surviving military orders, relocated their headquarters to the island of Cyprus, a Crusader-controlled territory that would remain under Christian rule for considerably longer than the mainland ever had. For an order whose entire founding purpose, nearly 2 centuries earlier, had been the protection of pilgrims traveling to a Jerusalem now permanently beyond Crusader reach, the loss of Acre raised a question the Templars would spend the following decades unable to answer convincingly. What, exactly, was the order actually for now? The decades following Acre's fall were, for the Knights Templar, a period of genuine institutional uncertainty, even as the Order's European financial and landholding operations continued functioning largely as they always had. Proposals began circulating, including from within the papacy itself, suggesting that the 2 great military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, ought to merge into a single unified organization, consolidating resources and personnel that no longer needed to be split between rival institutions defending territory that, in the Templars' case at least, no longer existed to defend. Templar leadership resisted these merger proposals, citing the order's distinct traditions and, though this was rarely stated quite so plainly in official correspondence, its considerable independent wealth and institutional identity, neither of which its leadership had any particular appetite to dissolve into a rival order structure. A formal church council held at Lyon in 1274, more than a decade before Acre's actual fall, had already debated a similar merger proposal, driven by broadly the same underlying logic that would resurface after 1291, that 2 large, wealthy, Independent military orders serving an increasingly beleaguered and shrinking cause represented an inefficient duplication of resources better consolidated into one. That earlier proposal went nowhere, defeated substantially by exactly the same institutional resistance from both orders that would frustrate later merger attempts as well. But its recurrence across several decades and two separate church councils illustrates that outside observers had recognized the Templars' underlying structural problem well before the order's own leadership was prepared to take the warning seriously. This resistance to consolidation, reasonable enough from the Templars' own institutional perspective, nonetheless left the order in an increasingly exposed position as the 14th century began. Without an active military mission in the Holy Land to justify its considerable European wealth, tax exemptions, and independence from local secular and ecclesiastical authority, the Templars increasingly resembled, to outside observers across Europe, an enormously rich, essentially unaccountable organization whose original purpose had simply evaporated, while its privileges and holdings remained fully intact. Local nobles who had long resented the tax-exempt, semi-sovereign Templar commanderies scattered across their own territories now had considerably less reason to tolerate that arrangement, and considerably more reason to eye the order's wealth with open acquisitiveness. Nowhere would this combination of resentment, opportunity, and genuine desperation converge more dangerously than in the court of the King of France, whose own financial situation, by the first decade of the 14th century, had grown severe enough to make the enormous, tax-exempt fortune sitting inside his own capital city an increasingly difficult temptation to ignore. Jacques de Molay, elected Grand Master in 1292, the year after Acre's fall, inherited an order headquartered on Cyprus and facing exactly the identity crisis this account has just described, and spent much of the following decade and a half attempting, with only partial success, to answer it. Molay traveled repeatedly between Cyprus and Western Europe during his tenure, lobbying kings and the papacy for support for a renewed major crusade to reclaim the Holy Land, and personally opposing the merger proposals this account has already mentioned, arguing that the Templars and Hospitallers, as genuinely distinct institutions with their own histories and traditions, would serve any future crusading effort more effectively kept separate than combined into a single unwieldy organization. Molay also engaged in smaller-scale military operations from Cyprus during these years, including participating in a 1300 assault on the Egyptian coast conducted in loose coordination with the Mongol Ilkhanate contacts this account has just described, and briefly helping garrison a small offshore Templar outpost on the island of Ruad, near the Syrian coast, which Mamluk forces recaptured in 1302 after a prolonged siege. A minor engagement in the broader scheme of crusading history, but the last direct Templar military foothold anywhere on or near the Levantine mainland, and its fall marked, in a quiet and now largely forgotten way, the genuine final end of nearly 2 centuries of continuous Templar presence in the region the order had originally been founded to protect. By the time Pope Clement V summoned Molay back to France in 1307, ostensibly to discuss the merger question and a possible new crusade directly, Molay had spent 15 years trying, with only modest success, to give his order a convincing answer to the question of its own continued purpose. He arrived in France that year still holding out hope of a substantive conversation about the crusading movement's future. He would instead find himself, within months, at the center of the most consequential arrest in the order's entire 2-century history. Philip IV of France, who had ruled the kingdom since 1285, faced by the early 14th century a genuinely severe fiscal crisis, Driven substantially by the costs of prolonged and expensive military campaigns in Flanders, alongside a general pattern of royal spending that had repeatedly outpaced the crown's available revenue throughout his reign. Philip had already resorted to a series of increasingly aggressive measures to raise funds, debasing the royal currency, taxing the clergy over the papacy's own objections, and, in 1306, expelling France's Jewish population and confiscating their property outright, a brutal precedent that reveals, in retrospect, a monarch already willing to target a wealthy, legally vulnerable minority population when his treasury required it. Philip's relationship with the Templars specifically was complicated by more than simple resentment of their wealth. During a violent riot in Paris in 1306, Philip had reportedly taken personal refuge inside the fortified Paris Temple, the order's heavily defended headquarters, an episode that gave the king a first-hand, close-up view of the sheer scale of wealth the order kept behind its walls. The French crown, as this account has already described, had also borrowed substantially from the Templars over the years, meaning Philip stood, quite literally, as one of the order's own significant debtors, a detail modern historians widely regard as a genuinely important, if rarely publicly stated, motive behind what Philip did next. Philip's political position relative to the papacy had also shifted considerably in his favor. His predecessor as Pope, Boniface VIII, had clashed bitterly with Philip over the extent of royal authority relative to papal authority, a conflict that ended with Boniface's death in 1303. Shortly after Philip's agents physically assaulted the elderly pope at his residence in Anagni, Italy, a genuinely shocking act of royal aggression against the papacy that nonetheless went, in practical terms, essentially unpunished. Boniface's eventual successor, Clement V, elected in 1305, was a Frenchman who relocated the papal seat to Avignon, in territory under substantial French influence, beginning the period historians call the Avignon papacy, and giving Philip a pope considerably more exposed to direct French royal pressure than any of his predecessors had been. With a debt he had no easy means of repaying, a vulnerable and pliable pope, and a wealthy, semi-independent organization that increasingly lacked any obvious modern justification for its privileges, Philip had, by 1307, assembled every element he needed to move against the Templars directly. He needed only a pretext, and a plan precise enough to prevent the order from resisting or fleeing once that plan was set into motion. Philip did not design the legal and propaganda campaign against the Templars personally. That work fell to two of his most capable and most ruthless legal ministers, men whose names appear considerably less often in popular retellings of this story than Philip's own, despite doing much of the actual work of building the case against the order. Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's keeper of the seals and one of his closest advisors, had already demonstrated exactly the kind of aggressive willingness to move against powerful religious targets that the Templar case would require. Nogaret was the same official who had personally led the 1303 assault on Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni, an episode this account has already described, making him, by the time the Templar operation began, a minister with direct, practiced experience turning royal. Aggression against the Church's own senior figures. Working alongside Nogaret, Guillaume de Plaisance served as one of the case's chief legal prosecutors, delivering formal public accusations against the Templars before church officials and playing a central role in shaping the specific charges, heresy, idolatry, and the other accusations this account has already cataloged, into a legally coherent case dressed in the language of church doctrine, even as its underlying motive remained substantially financial and political. Both men had risen through Philip's service specifically by demonstrating a talent for turning royal will into legally defensible action against targets the crown found inconvenient, whether that target was a sitting pope or, in 1307, one of Christendom's oldest and most privileged religious orders, a skill set the Templar case would demand in full measure, given how directly it required overriding the order's own papal protections. The plan Philip's government executed was, by the logistical standards of any medieval government, remarkably ambitious, sealed orders, distributed in advance to royal officials across the entirety of France, instructing each of them to arrest every Templar within their jurisdiction on the same day, opening the sealed instructions only once that specific date arrived, so that no advance warning could reach the order's leadership or allow any coordinated resistance or escape. That date was Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. And while modern popular culture has attached the unlucky Friday the 13th superstition to this event with considerably more confidence than the historical record actually supports, since the specific superstition combining an unlucky Friday with an unlucky 13 is not clearly documented in surviving sources until centuries later, the coincidence of dates remains one of history's genuinely striking ones regardless of exactly how directly it shaped the later folklore. Before dawn on that Friday, royal officials across France simultaneously arrested essentially the entire Templar membership within the kingdom, seizing order properties and records in the same coordinated sweep. Jacques de Molay himself was taken directly from the Paris Temple, the order's own heavily fortified headquarters, and an arrest whose sheer audacity underscores just how confident Philip's government had become, seizing the Grand Master from inside the most secure Templar stronghold in France, on the same morning as several thousand of his subordinates were being taken across the rest of the kingdom, without the coordinated operation suffering any evident leak or breakdown severe enough to allow meaningful resistance anywhere. The seized Templar properties themselves proved a further, immediate practical windfall for the French crown, since royal officials took inventory of and began administering vast stores of grain, wine, livestock, coin, and precious objects the moment each local arrest was completed, placing the entire material apparatus of the order's French holdings under direct royal control well before any formal legal verdict had been reached regarding whether the order had actually done anything to justify the seizure in the first place. The charges leveled against the arrested Templars were extensive and, by any reasonable modern historical assessment, largely fabricated or extracted under coercion. Denying Christ and spitting or trampling upon the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, engaging in obscene ritual kissing, practicing sodomy, and worshipping an idol variously described in different confessions as a bearded head sometimes referred to by the name Baphomet, a term whose exact origin remains genuinely debated among historians, with some scholars proposing it as a garbled medieval corruption of Muhammad, reflecting the same kind of hostile, distorted stereotyping of Islam common throughout Crusading-era Christian polemic, while others regard it as a name invented outright under the pressure of interrogation. None of these specific charges rest on any credible independent evidence beyond the confessions extracted from arrested Templars themselves, confessions this account will examine directly in the next chapter, and whose circumstances make them, in the assessment of essentially every serious modern historian who has studied the case, deeply unreliable as evidence of any actual wrongdoing. What is not in dispute is the raw scale and precision of the operation itself. Within a single coordinated morning, an organization that had stood for nearly 2 centuries, that answered in theory to the Pope alone, and that had counted kings among its debtors and its protectors, found its entire French membership under arrest, its property seized, and its fate no longer remotely in its own hands. The interrogations that followed the October arrests relied extensively on torture, conducted under the authority of inquisitors operating in close coordination with Philip's own royal officials, a combination of religious and secular pressures specifically calculated to produce confessions regardless of whatever the arrested Templars had or had not actually done. Contemporary and later historical analysis of the surviving interrogation records reveals exactly the pattern one would expect from coerced testimony extracted under systematic torture. Confessions that varied wildly in their specific details from prisoner to prisoner, confessions that closely echoed the specific language and accusations their interrogators had already put to them, and a strikingly high rate of initial confession followed once torture was removed or reduced by later. Retraction. Jacques de Molay, the Order's Grand Master and its most senior member in captivity, exemplifies this pattern with particular clarity. Molay confessed, under interrogation, to several of the charges leveled against the Order, testimony that Philip's government moved swiftly and publicly to publicize as vindication of the arrests. Molay would later retract this confession, then, according to some accounts, waver between confession and retraction more than once over the following years of imprisonment, a pattern of shifting testimony that reads, to modern historians examining the record, far more consistently with a man responding to alternating pressure and reprieve than with a man genuinely wrestling with guilt over real crimes. The retraction itself carried a horrifying legal consequence within the framework of medieval inquisitorial law. A confessed heretic who retracted their confession was not simply believed and released, but was instead classified as a relapsed heretic, a category that made execution, typically by burning, the mandated outcome regardless of whether the original confession had been true. This created a genuinely inescapable trap for the arrested Templars: confess, and stand condemned by your own words, retract that confession, and be condemned more severely still, as someone who had confessed truth and then compounded the offense by denying it. Considerable numbers of Templars died within this trap, burned as relapsed heretics for withdrawing confessions that most modern historians regard as having been false, coerced, and extracted specifically to produce exactly the outcome Philip's government required. In May of 1310 alone, 54 Templars who had retracted earlier confessions were burned together outside Paris in a single, deliberately public mass execution, a spectacle that unmistakably served to discourage any other imprisoned Templar from attempting the same retraction. That mass execution did not occur in a vacuum. It came as a direct response to what had briefly looked like a genuine organized defense of the Order. One modern accounts of the Templars' trials sometimes pass over too quickly given how significant it actually was. Early in 1310, a Templar priest named Pierre de Bologna, alongside several other Templars willing to speak publicly, organized a formal legal defense of the Order before the Papal Commission investigating the case, arguing forcefully that the confessions extracted in 1307 had been coerced through torture and did not reflect the truth. Remarkably, more than 500 Templars reportedly came forward at this point, prepared to testify in the Order's defense and to retract their own earlier coerced confessions as part of this coordinated effort. This organized defense posed a genuine threat to the case Philip's government had spent 2.5 years constructing, and the response came swiftly and brutally. The Archbishop of Sens, an ecclesiastical official firmly aligned with Philip's interests, asserted jurisdiction over the Templars being held in his archdiocese and, in May of 1310, condemned 54 of them as relapsed heretics, the mass burning this account has already described, a calculated demonstration that retracting a confession, however coerced the original testimony had been, meant death regardless of any broader legal defense effort underway elsewhere in the proceedings. Pierre de Boulogne himself disappeared from the historical record shortly afterward, his ultimate fate never definitively documented, though few historians consider it likely he survived long. The organized defense collapsed almost immediately in the aftermath, its remaining supporters terrified into silence or renewed confession by a demonstration of lethal royal resolve that left little room for anyone still in custody to imagine that telling the truth about their earlier torture might actually help them. Pope Clement V's initial response to Philip's October arrests was, contrary to what Philip likely hoped for, genuine resistance rather than immediate cooperation. The Templars were, under the papal privileges this account described earlier, answerable to the Pope alone, and Philip's unilateral action against an order technically outside his own jurisdiction represented, in Clement's own assessment, a significant overreach of royal authority into properly ecclesiastical affairs. Clement initially suspended the authority of the French inquisitors conducting the interrogations and demanded the Templars be transferred to papal custody for a proper church investigation, a demand Philip's government worked to delay and obstruct through the following months. Facing sustained political pressure from Philip's government, and genuinely persuaded by at least some of the confessions already extracted, Clement eventually shifted toward cooperation, issuing the bull Pastoralis Preeminentia in November of 1307, instructing rulers across Christian Europe to arrest Templars within their own territories and investigate the charges through proper ecclesiastical channels. The results of this wider, Europe-spanning set of trials varied enormously by region, in a pattern that itself speaks volumes about how much the outcome in France specifically reflected Philip's own direct political pressure rather than any genuinely independent finding of widespread Templar guilt. In England, initial investigations found essentially no credible evidence supporting the charges, and confessions, where they occurred at all, came only after English authorities eventually permitted a degree of torture under continued papal and French pressure, torture that had not been part of standard English legal practice and that English authorities applied with evident reluctance. King Edward II of England, upon first receiving word of the French arrests, wrote directly to several other European monarchs expressing open skepticism of the charges, describing them as scarcely credible and urging caution before any similar action was taken against Templars in his own kingdom, a genuinely striking early reaction from a fellow reigning monarch. Though Edward's skepticism did not survive indefinitely against the combined pressure of Pope Clement V and the broader European trend his own French father-in-law, Philip IV, had set in motion. Edward eventually ordered English Templars arrested as well, though the proceedings that followed in England remained markedly less severe than their French counterpart throughout. In the Iberian kingdoms, Templar knights in several cases actively resisted arrest militarily, and where the order was eventually dissolved, its personnel and considerable local assets were frequently absorbed largely intact into newly created successor orders, most notably the Order of Christ in Portugal, an organization that would later fund and staff a significant portion of Portugal's 15th-century maritime exploration ventures using resources substantially inherited from the dissolved Templars. In Germany, several regional church councils investigating the charges found the Templars innocent outright. Only in France, where the trials had originated and where Philip's direct pressure remained most sustained and most severe, did the pattern of mass confession, torture, and execution reach anything close to the scale this account has already described. This regional unevenness is, in its own right, among the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence modern historians point to when assessing the charge's credibility. If the Templars had genuinely practiced the secret heretical rites described in the French Confessions, a shared, internationally coordinated ritual practice, as the charges themselves implied, one would reasonably expect roughly consistent evidence of it to emerge wherever Templars were investigated, regardless of which kingdom happened to be conducting the inquiry. Instead, the pattern of confession tracked remarkably closely with the pattern of applied torture and political pressure, appearing overwhelmingly where France's direct influence reached most forcefully, and vanishing almost entirely wherever local authorities investigated independently and declined to adopt French methods, a correlation considerably easier to explain through coercion than through any genuine, geographically inconsistent heretical conspiracy. By 1312, Pope Clement V faced a genuinely difficult institutional problem, regardless of what he personally believed about the specific charges against the order. The years of trials had produced a deeply contradictory body of evidence, confessions in France that read, to any careful reader, as the product of systematic coercion, alongside near-total exoneration in several other regions of Europe, while the scandal itself had grown large and public enough that simply restoring the Templars to their previous status, privileges intact, had become politically untenable regardless of the underlying truth of the charges. At the church council convened in the French city of Vienne in 1312, Clement V resolved this impasse not by formally declaring the Templars guilty, which the fractured and contradictory evidence would have made difficult to sustain, but by dissolving the order administratively through the papal bull Vox in Excelso, issued in March of 1312. This distinction matters considerably more than popular retellings of the Templars' downfall often acknowledge. The order was suppressed by way of provision, a specific canon law mechanism allowing dissolution for the good of the Church without requiring a formal guilty verdict, rather than being convicted outright of the specific heresies its members had confessed to under torture. In the Vatican's own strict legal terms, the Templars were shut down, but never actually proven guilty. The order's considerable remaining assets, those Philip's government had not already seized, taxed, or otherwise diverted to the French crown's own benefit during the years of trial and investigation, were formally transferred to the Hospitallers, the Templars' longtime rival military order, through a further bull, ad providem, later that same year. Philip, notably, extracted substantial administrative costs and expenses from this transferred property before releasing it, ensuring the French crown profited handsomely from the whole affair even after the international scandal of the trials themselves had run its course. The Hospitallers themselves, it is worth noting, had not sought this windfall and reportedly received it with something closer to wary obligation than celebration. Absorbing former Templar properties meant absorbing former Templar debts, administrative disputes, and the ongoing costs of provisioning pensions for surviving former Templar personnel, all while the Hospitallers' own resources remained committed to their continuing military presence in the eastern Mediterranean. Some regions took years, in certain cases even decades, to complete the actual legal transfer of specific properties as local disputes, competing claims from secular nobility, and continued royal extraction of fees dragged the process out well past Clement V's original 1312 bull. The order that had once served kings as bankers and fought across the length of the crusading world for nearly 2 centuries had, in the space of 5 years, been arrested, tried, and formally erased. All that remained was to determine the fate of its final Grand Master, still held in French custody as the Vienne Council concluded its business. Popular retellings of the Templars' downfall tend to focus, understandably, on the order's most senior figures, Molay, the mass burnings, the dramatic public trials. But the great majority of the roughly 2,000 Templars arrested within France alone were, in fact, ordinary sergeants, chaplains, farmers, and estate managers, men whose individual fates rarely made it into any chronicle and whose names survive today, if at all, only in scattered inquisitorial records rather than any. Connected narrative. The bull ad providem, which transferred most surviving Templar assets to the Hospitallers, also addressed the question of what should become of these rank-and-file former Templars who had not been executed as relapsed heretics. Those who had confessed and been reconciled to the Church were generally to receive modest pensions, drawn from the very Templar properties now under Hospitaller administration, sufficient to support them, in theory, for the remainder of their lives. In practice, the record of how consistently these pensions were actually paid, and for how long, is spotty and incomplete, varying considerably by region and by the Hospitaller's own administrative capacity and willingness to honor obligations attached to property they had, after all, received largely as an unplanned windfall rather than something they had sought out. Many former Templars simply disappear from the historical record entirely after 1312, some presumably absorbed quietly into other religious orders, some returning to ordinary secular life among family who had never left it, and some, in all likelihood, living out considerably diminished remaining years on pensions that arrived irregularly if at all. It is this largely undocumented majority, far more than Molay or the Order's other senior leadership, who arguably bore the most lasting, least remarked upon cost of Philip IV's operation. An army of former warrior monks quietly absorbed back into an ordinary medieval world that had, within the space of 5 years, stopped having any use for the institution that had structured their entire adult lives. Jacques de Molay remained imprisoned for 2 additional years following the Council of Vienne's dissolution of the order he had led, his own case handled separately from the broader institutional question the council had already resolved. In March of 1314, a papal commission in Paris prepared to formally sentence Molay, alongside several other senior Templar officials, expecting the proceeding to conclude with a relatively routine confirmation of a life sentence, consistent with Molay's own prior confession years earlier. Instead, according to multiple contemporary chroniclers, Molay used the public proceeding to dramatically retract his confession, declaring the order innocent of the charges against it and denouncing his own earlier admission as false testimony extracted through torture and fear. This public retraction, delivered before a crowd rather than in the relative privacy of an earlier interrogation, left the authorities with little practical choice under the relapsed heretic framework this account described earlier, a framework, worth remembering, that treated retraction of a coerced confession as compounding the offense rather than correcting an injustice. Philip IV, learning of the retraction, ordered Molay and a fellow senior Templar, Geoffroy de Charny, burned at the stake that same day, bypassing further formal proceedings entirely. Contemporary accounts describe Molay facing his execution with a composure that struck several onlookers as remarkable given the circumstances, a calm some later. More sympathetic retellings would read as evidence of genuine innocence and quiet dignity in the face of injustice, and which a more skeptical reading might simply attribute to a man who had already endured 7 years of imprisonment and interrogation and had, by that final morning, very little left to fear that further composure could meaningfully protect him from. Molay and Charny were executed on a small island in the Seine, within sight of Notre Dame, on the 18th of March, 1314. Later medieval and early modern legend holds that Molay, from the flames, cursed both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, summoning them to answer for their actions before God's own judgment within the year. A story genuinely worth treating with real historical caution, since its earliest surviving written appearances date from considerably later than the execution itself, and it bears the unmistakable hallmarks of the kind of dramatic legend that tends to accrete around executed figures, regardless of what they may or may not have actually said in their final moments. What this account can report as verified historical fact, rather than legend, is a genuinely striking coincidence. Pope Clement V died within roughly a month of Molay's execution, and King Philip IV died later that same year, in November, following a hunting accident. Correlation, in a case like this, is obviously not evidence of any actual curse, but it is easy to understand exactly why medieval and early modern audiences, encountering this sequence of events, found the legend of Molay's dying curse so immediately and durably compelling. Having walked through the Templars' downfall in some detail, it's worth stepping back and asking directly what modern historical scholarship actually concludes caused it. Because the gap between the charges leveled in 1307 and the reasons historians now believe actually drove those charges is, itself, one of the more instructive parts of this entire story. Essentially, no serious modern historian regards the specific accusations, idol worship, ritual blasphemy, sodomy, as reflecting genuine Templar practice. The confessions supporting these charges were extracted overwhelmingly through torture, varied inconsistently between prisoners in ways inconsistent with a genuinely shared secret practice, and were frequently retracted the moment torture was removed, all patterns thoroughly consistent with coerced false confession rather than uncovered truth. The actual motives behind Philip IV's action, by contrast, are considerably easier to establish with confidence, and this account has already laid out the relevant evidence across several earlier chapters. A king in severe financial distress, personally indebted to the very organization he moved against, ruling at a moment when the Templars' original crusading purpose had evaporated along with the Crusader states themselves, backed by a pope whose own position depended substantially on French political support. Seizing the assets of a wealthy, semi-independent organization that no longer had an obvious modern justification for its privileges, using fabricated or exaggerated charges as legal cover, fits a pattern historians recognize from other medieval and early modern persecutions of wealthy, legally vulnerable groups, a pattern, this account should note directly, disturbingly similar to Philip's own earlier expulsion and expropriation of France's Jewish population in 1306, discussed in an earlier chapter. It's worth being precise about how much money actually changed hands, since the scale helps explain why Philip pursued the case with such sustained determination across nearly 7 years, well past the point where a purely symbolic victory would have served any obvious political purpose. Templar cash, plate, and movable valuables seized in the initial 1307 arrests alone amounted to a substantial sum by the standards of any medieval royal treasury, and the years of subsequent litigation, administrative fees, and delayed asset transfer to the Hospitallers allowed the French crown to extract further value from Templar property for the better part of a decade before most of it was finally, and only partially, released. Modern historians examining the Crown's own surviving financial records generally conclude that the operation, whatever its moral and legal cost, succeeded in its core financial objective. It meaningfully eased Philip's debt burden, even if the total windfall likely fell somewhat short of what Philip's government may originally have hoped to extract from an order once assumed, not entirely without reason, to be sitting on the greatest concentration of liquid wealth in the kingdom. The clearest piece of evidence supporting this reading of events did not surface until nearly 7 centuries after Molay's execution, buried within the Vatican's own archival holdings. In 2001, Italian historian Barbara Frale, conducting research within the Vatican secret archives, correctly identified the significance of a document that had technically been cataloged for years but effectively misfiled and overlooked. A parchment recording proceedings held at the castle of Chinon in August of 1308, where a papal commission had personally interviewed Jacques de Molay and several other senior Templar leaders. According to the Chinon parchment, Pope Clement V's own commissioners, after hearing this testimony directly, formally absolved the Templar leadership of the specific charge of heresy, readmitting them to the sacraments of the Church in a recorded act of reconciliation, even as Clement, under the sustained political pressure this account has already described, continued moving toward the administrative dissolution of the order as an institution. The Vatican's eventual decision to make this discovery public in 2007 was handled with a degree of institutional caution that says something in itself. A facsimile edition of the parchment was published in a strictly limited run of 799 numbered copies, a small, careful gesture toward transparency about a 700-year-old case the Church itself had never fully closed. What the Chinon parchment demonstrates is not a simple, tidy vindication that erases the rest of this story's genuine complexity. The order was still dissolved, its members still imprisoned, tortured, and in many cases executed, and none of that changed. What it demonstrates, and the Church's own contemporary record, is that the Pope who ultimately dissolved the Knights Templar had personally been told by his own investigators, and had apparently believed, that the central charge used to justify destroying the order was not actually true, a private conclusion he evidently felt unable to act on publicly, caught as he was between his own judgment and the political reality of a French king who would not be denied. The Templars' dramatic and very public downfall, a wealthy, secretive, powerful organization suddenly destroyed on shocking charges, its last leader executed while proclaiming innocence and, according to legend, cursing his persecutors from the flames, proved, almost immediately, to be exactly the kind of story later generations found irresistible to retell, embellish, and reinterpret. Within the medieval period itself, the Templars' fall entered popular memory less as a specific case of royal financial opportunism, which is how modern historians generally understand it, and more as a dramatic morality tale about the fall of the proud and the vulnerability of even the mightiest institutions to sudden reversal. This transformation from historical event into cultural symbol accelerated considerably in the centuries that followed, aided by several genuine, factual mysteries the historical record itself never fully resolved. A persistent legend, for instance, holds that a portion of the Templar fleet, based at the Atlantic port of La Rochelle, sailed away before the October 1307 arrests could reach them, escaping with a portion of the order's treasury and records to some undisclosed destination, a story historians generally regard as unproven and likely legendary, since no reliable contemporary evidence documents any such escape, though the order's genuine historical naval presence at La Rochelle gives the legend just enough factual grounding to remain durably attractive. That genuine naval presence is itself worth understanding on its own terms, apart from the legend built on top of it. The Templars maintained a modest but genuinely functional Mediterranean and Atlantic maritime capability throughout much of their history, operating ships primarily to transport pilgrims, supplies, and troops between their European commanderies and their Levantine and later Cypriot holdings, rather than maintaining anything resembling a full independent battle fleet on the scale of, say, The Italian maritime republics of Venice or Genoa. Templar ships operated from several Mediterranean and Atlantic ports across the Order's European holdings, La Rochelle among them, and the Order's naval logistics played a genuinely important supporting role in sustaining the Crusader state's fragile lines of supply and reinforcement across the whole of the 12th and 13th centuries. Unglamorous, rarely mentioned in popular retellings, and considerably more historically documented than the specific La Rochelle escaped legend it eventually gave rise to. It was against this backdrop of genuine historical drama, real unresolved questions, and an organization whose actual complexity had already begun fading behind a simpler, more dramatic popular narrative that later centuries would build an entirely new mythology around the Templars, one owing considerably more to 18th century fraternal invention and 19th century romantic imagination than to anything the historical Templars themselves ever actually did. The most historically significant of these later reinventions emerged from 18th century Freemasonry, a fraternal movement that had, by the middle of that century, developed numerous competing branches and rites, several of which began incorporating elaborate claims of descent from medieval chivalric orders, the Templars prominent among them. The most influential of these claims came from a German Masonic movement called the Rite of Strict Observance, founded around 1751 by Baron Karl Gotthelf von Hund, which taught that the Knights Templar had never actually been destroyed in 1312, but had instead survived in unbroken secret succession, its true leadership continuing underground for over 4 centuries before eventually re-emerging within Freemasonry itself. This claim rests on no credible historical evidence whatsoever, and modern historians of both Freemasonry and the actual medieval Templars reject it essentially unanimously. The documented historical record of the Templars' dissolution, the Council of Vienne, the transfer of assets to the Hospitallers, the scattering or absorption of remaining Templar personnel into other orders or back into ordinary secular and religious life across Europe, leaves no genuine gap in which a continuous secret organization could plausibly have persisted undetected for 4 centuries, particularly given how thoroughly documented the Templars' actual 13th and 14th century affairs otherwise remain. Von Hund's claims are generally understood today as either a genuine, sincerely held but factually mistaken belief on his part, or a deliberate fabrication intended to lend his particular Masonic rite additional prestige and a more romantic, dramatic pedigree than an honest account of Freemasonry's own considerably more recent origins could offer. Despite this lack of any credible historical foundation, the Templar Masonic connection proved durable and influential. Modern York Rite Freemasonry, still practiced today, includes a Knights Templar degree explicitly invoking the medieval order's name, imagery, and symbolism. An honest fraternal tribute and thematic inheritance, worth stating clearly, rather than any claim of genuine unbroken historical continuity, though the distinction between the two has not always been observed with equal care by every writer who has taken up the subject in the centuries since von Hund first advanced his claims. The 19th century's broader Romantic movement, fascinated across the board with medieval chivalry and reconstructed national pasts, further cemented the Templars' transformed cultural image, for better and for worse. Walter Scott's enormously popular 1819 novel Ivanhoe features a proud, morally compromised Templar knight, Brian de Bois Guilbert, as one of its central antagonists. A portrayal that did as much as any single work to fix, in the English-speaking popular imagination, an image of the Templar as a figure of corrupted religious authority and barely restrained menace, an image with only loose grounding in the actual documented history this account has spent most of its runtime describing. between Scott's fiction, von Hund's Masonic invention, and the genuine unresolved mysteries surrounding the order's actual downfall. The 19th century handed the 20th century a version of the Templars already substantially reshaped into legend. Well before the modern pseudo-historical publishing boom, this account will turn to next added its own considerable layer on top. Beyond Freemasonry specifically, the Templars have accumulated, particularly over the past half-century, an enormous body of popular and pseudo-historical association with the legendary Holy Grail, the sacred vessel of medieval Arthurian romance, most famously linked to the cup used at the Last Supper. Despite there being essentially no credible historical evidence connecting the actual medieval Templars to any physical Grail relic whatsoever. Interestingly, the connection is not entirely invented from nothing. The medieval German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, writing his Grail romance Parzival in the early 13th century, imagined the Grail as guarded by a fictional order of knights he called the Templars, a name plainly evoking the real Knights Templar, a genuine piece of medieval literary imagination, existing alongside and likely inspired by the real order's contemporary fame, but a work of romance fiction rather than a historical record of any actual Templar Grail keeping. Rosslyn Chapel, a genuinely ornate and historically significant chapel in Scotland, has become one of the most visited sites associated with modern Templar Grail legend, particularly following the enormous popularity of pseudo-historical works beginning with the 1982 book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and continuing through the 2003 novel The Da Vinci Code and its subsequent film adaptation. The chapel's actual documented history undercuts the popular legend considerably. Rosslyn was built in the 15th century, more than 100 years after the Templars' dissolution in 1312, by the Sinclair family, with no credible historical evidence connecting its construction or its genuinely elaborate stone carvings to the historical Knights Templar at all. A detailed popular pseudo-historical treatments of the chapel tend to pass over considerably more quickly than they linger on the more romantic alternative. The chapel's genuinely striking carvings, which do include a wide range of botanical, geometric, and biblical imagery open to considerable interpretive speculation, are better explained, according to art historians who have studied them directly, as an expression of the eclectic Christian and chivalric symbolism fashionable among wealthy Scottish patrons of the period, rather than as coded messages left behind by a secret society with no verifiable connection to the site at all. Some version of the Templar Grail connection likely also owes a debt to the Order's own genuine historical wealth and mystery, an organization that really did guard treasure, really did maintain secret initiation rites, and really did vanish with dramatic suddenness, offering considerably more raw material for later legend building than most medieval institutions ever provided. This same pattern, genuine historical drama and real unresolved mystery, reshaped by later centuries into a considerably more sensational story than the documented evidence actually supports, recurs across a wide range of modern popular culture, from adventure fiction and film to video games and popular nonfiction treating hidden Templar treasure, secret bloodlines, and suppressed ancient knowledge as historical fact rather than the imaginative elaboration modern scholarship generally understands it to be. This same reinvention continues into the present day, taking new forms with each generation's own preferred entertainment medium. Steven Spielberg's 1989 film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade built an entire adventure narrative around a fictional Templar-guarded Holy Grail, the best-selling Assassin's Creed video game franchise. Beginning in 2007, casts a fictionalized version of the Templars as a century-spanning secret antagonist organization locked in eternal conflict with the game's own invented order of assassins. And countless documentaries, novels, and cable television specials continue presenting Hidden Templar. Treasure and suppressed ancient knowledge as plausible historical fact rather than the imaginative elaboration modern scholarship generally understands it to be. None of this popular fascination is inherently unreasonable to feel. This account has, after all, just spent an entire evening walking through a genuinely dramatic, genuinely mysterious piece of real history. But it is worth clearly distinguishing between the documented Templars this account has described and the considerably more elaborate legendary Templars popular culture has since constructed on top of that real historical foundation. It's worth closing this account's historical narrative before turning to what actually remains of the order today, by briefly setting the Templars' specific fate against the two other great military orders founded within decades of them, because the contrast makes clear just how much of the Templars' destruction reflected Philip IV's particular circumstances, rather than some inevitable end awaiting every crusading-era military order once the Holy Land itself was lost. The Hospitallers, founded slightly earlier than the Templars as a charitable order caring for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem before they too took on a military character, survived the end of the Crusader states by relocating first to the island of Rhodes, which they held and fortified for more than 2 centuries, repelling repeated Ottoman assaults before finally surrendering the island in 1522 after a prolonged and famous siege. Rather than dissolving after that defeat, the Hospitallers relocated again, granted the island of Malta by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1530, where they would achieve their most celebrated military feat, withstanding the Great Siege of Malta in 1565 against a massive Ottoman invasion force under Suleiman the Magnificent, a defense that became, in its own era, nearly as celebrated across Christian Europe as any crusading victory of the earlier medieval period. The order, in various institutional forms, survives into the present day as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, a genuinely unusual entity in modern international law, sovereign in a limited, specialized sense, maintaining diplomatic relations with numerous states and observer status at the United Nations, without controlling any significant territory of its own. The Teutonic Knights, a smaller, German-founded military order, took a third path entirely, shifting their focus away from the Holy Land toward the pagan Baltic peoples of northeastern Europe, conducting a prolonged series of campaigns historians call the Northern Crusades and gradually building an independent, church-founded territorial state across Prussia. When the Protestant Reformation swept across Germany in the 16th century, the order's own Grand Master, Albert of Brandenburg, converted to Lutheranism and secularized the order's Prussian territory into a hereditary duchy in 1525, a transformation that, traced forward across the following centuries, contributed directly to the eventual rise of the Kingdom of Prussia. 3 military orders, founded within a few decades of one another under strikingly similar circumstances, ended up following 3 entirely different paths: sudden violent destruction, adaptive survival through repeated relocation, and gradual secular political transformation, a reminder that the Templars' specific end was a product of specific, contingent political circumstance, not some fate written into the very concept of a crusading military order. Set aside the legends this account has already examined, and what the historical Templars actually left behind, in the most literal and verifiable sense, is stone. The Temple Church in London, consecrated in 1185 and still standing today, features a distinctive round nave, a design several Templar churches across Europe shared. deliberately modeled on the circular Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, making the round or polygonal floor plan something of an architectural signature of the order, immediately recognizable to anyone who knows to look for it. The Temple Church survives today as a working church shared between two of London's historic legal Inns of Court, its medieval effigies of armored knights still visible on the floor of the round nave, a genuinely rare physical connection to the order's earliest documented English presence. In Portugal, the Convent of Christ at Tomar, originally a Templar stronghold before passing, as this account described earlier, to the Order of Christ after the Dissolution, preserves its famous 16-sided charola, a round church built directly in the same Jerusalem-inspired architectural tradition as the London Temple Church, now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the best preserved pieces of genuine Templar architecture anywhere in Europe. Tomar itself withstood a Moorish siege in 1190, decades before the order's later troubles, a successful defense still commemorated locally today and a reminder that the fortress's walls were built, quite literally, to be tested in earnest rather than serving any purely ceremonial function. Beyond these two especially well-preserved examples, hundreds of smaller Templar commanderies and preceptory buildings survive in varying states across the French, English, and Iberian countryside, many long since repurposed for entirely different uses, some deliberately damaged or demolished in the aftermath of the 1307 arrests, and others simply absorbed quietly into local architecture, their original Templar origins forgotten for centuries until modern historical and archaeological research rediscovered them. These physical survivals, round churches, weathered commandery walls, effigies of knights whose names have not always survived alongside their carved likenesses, represent the most tangible, independently verifiable trace the historical Knights Templar actually left in the world, considerably less dramatic than any hidden vault of treasure, but real in a way no legend can quite match. Modern archaeological work has, in recent decades, added further quiet detail to this physical record, as excavations at former Templar sites across France, England, and Iberia continue to uncover building foundations, agricultural infrastructure, and everyday material culture, pottery, tools, coins, that tell a far more mundane, and in its own way far more human, story than any of the popular legends this account has already examined, the story of an ordinary, functioning medieval institution, going about the daily business of farming, building, praying, and record-keeping across thousands of properties for nearly 2 centuries before that business came to its sudden and well-documented end. Stripped of the later legendary accretions this account has just described, what the historical Knights Templar actually left behind is, in its own right, genuinely significant, even if less immediately dramatic than hidden treasure or secret bloodlines. The Order's pioneering role in developing practical, large-scale financial instruments, letters of credit, secure cross-border fund transfer, and sophisticated treasury management represented a genuine and influential contribution to the broader medieval development of financial practice, even though modern historians generally caution against overstating any direct institutional lineage connecting the Templars specifically to later, distinct developments in Italian and broader European banking, which arose from their own separate merchant and banking traditions rather than any direct Templar inheritance. The Italian banking families and merchant houses that would come to dominate European finance in the centuries following the Templars' dissolution, the Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence, and later the Medici, developed their own instruments and networks largely independently, drawing on the commercial needs of Mediterranean trade rather than on any direct Templar model. A parallel evolution rather than a borrowed inheritance, though the broader medieval world the Templars had helped accustom to. The basic idea of paper credit standing in for physical coin was, in its own diffuse way, more receptive ground for what came next than it might otherwise have been. The order's dissolution also reshaped the landscape of European military religious orders in ways that persisted for centuries afterward, as the previous two chapters have already traced in some detail. The Hospitallers absorbing the bulk of surviving Templar assets and continuing as a sovereign military religious power in their own right, and the Order of Christ in Portugal inheriting substantial former Templar wealth and personnel, later playing a documented, significant role funding and staffing Portugal's 15th century maritime exploration efforts. Some genuine institutional thread connecting the historical Templars to the broader currents of later European history does exist. In other words, even if it looks considerably less dramatic than the version popular legend generally prefers. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, though, is less institutional than symbolic. The Templars occupy a genuinely unusual place in Western historical memory as both a celebrated ideal of disciplined religious chivalry and, simultaneously, one of history's most frequently cited examples of a wealthy, powerful institution destroyed through fabricated charges and coerced confession for the financial and political benefit of the accuser. Both of these images contain real historical truth, and understanding the Templars honestly requires holding both at once, the genuine military discipline and financial innovation of their two-century rise, alongside the genuine injustice, however politically convenient at the time, of exactly how that story came to its end. Modern scholarship on the Templars has, if anything, grown considerably more active and more nuanced in recent decades, driven substantially by exactly the kind of archival rediscovery the Chinon parchment represents. A reminder that this particular 700-year-old case is not a closed historical question so much as one still being actively refined as historians continue working through the substantial body of trial records, financial documents, and church correspondence the affair generated. Each new piece of evidence tends to reinforce rather than overturn the broad consensus this account has already described, a financially and administratively formidable order, undone not by any genuine secret it kept, but by the very ordinary, very human combination of royal debt, political opportunity, and a legal system willing to manufacture whatever confession its methods required. Look back now across the whole of this account, from 9 knights guarding a dangerous pilgrim road to bankers managing the treasury of the King of France, from disciplined victories on Crusader battlefields to a single coordinated dawn arrest that ended 2 centuries of institutional power within the span of a few catastrophic years. The Knights Templar were, when you set the legend aside, a genuinely remarkable medieval institution, not because of any hidden treasure or secret bloodline, but because an organization built specifically to protect vulnerable travelers on a dangerous road grew, through a combination of religious conviction, disciplined organization, and genuine financial innovation, into one of the most powerful institutions in Western Christendom, before being destroyed by exactly the kind of political and financial calculation that has ended powerful institutions throughout human history, dressed up, as it so often is, and accusations far more dramatic than the underlying motive ever actually was. The date of that destruction's opening act, a Friday in October bearing a number some later century decided was unlucky, outlived almost everything else about the order in ordinary popular memory, a small, almost accidental detail that proved, across 7 centuries, more durable in the popular imagination than the Council of Troyes, the Battle of Montbéliard, or the Chinon Parchment's quiet, recently rediscovered suggestion that the Pope who dissolved the order may never have actually believed it guilty. That is, in its own way, a fitting final observation about how history and legend actually relate to one another, not as opposites competing for the same space, but as 2 different accounts of the same events, one considerably more interested in what can be documented and verified, the other considerably more interested in what makes a story worth telling and retelling, 700 years after everyone who actually lived it has been gone. Perhaps that is reason enough to let the actual history matter a little more than it usually gets to. The Templars were not guardians of a hidden bloodline or keepers of a vanished relic. They were something in its own way more interesting, an ordinary, fallible human institution, capable of genuine discipline and genuine innovation, brought down not by any curse or conspiracy beyond the very ordinary human weaknesses of debt, ambition, and power. 9 knights became bankers to kings. A vow of poverty built one of Europe's great fortunes. A king's debt, dressed in the language of heresy, ended it all in a single coordinated morning, and a superstition about an unlucky date outlived nearly all of it in ordinary memory. That, rather than any secret they may or may not have kept, is the story actually worth carrying with you as you finally let the evening, and everything in it, go.